All right, hello everyone. We just started this, so we're going to give folks a few seconds to join, and then we will kickstart our conversation. So just hang tight for a few seconds and we'll get started. Thank you all for joining. All right, just giving folks a few more seconds to join here. All right. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for LGBTQ Civil Rights, the Supreme Court, and the Future of Foster Care, brought to you by the USC Lambda LGBT Alumni Association and the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. My name is Jonathan Rosales, and I'm the director of USC Lambda. Before we get to today's presentation, I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to make a donation of any size to the USC Lambda Scholarship Fund or the Dworak-Peck LGBTQ Scholarship Fund. Your contribution will help support the incredible LGBTQ students at USC doing important work in social work and a myriad of other fields. We will be putting the links to donate in our chat, so please check those out when you have a chance. I'd also like to encourage everyone to please sign up for Lambda's mailing list so you can stay up to date on all the latest Lambda happenings, such as our homecoming out tailgate on October 30th before the Arizona football game, and our scholarship gala taking place on April 9th next year. The link to sign up for our mailing list can also be found in the chat in just a second. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. First up, we have Conor Fetting-Smith, who is a member of Lambda's board of directors and a documentary filmmaker who produced Apple TV's Visible, out on television, and Coded, The Hidden Love of J.C. Leyendecker, among other credits, and is currently at work on his feature directorial debut, a documentary about the Supreme Court case, Fulton versus Philadelphia, and the civil rights of LGBTQ foster youth and parents. And then we have Dr. Devon Brooks, who has been a professor at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work since 1999, teaching human behavior and research methodology. His research and practice interests generally revolve around the reduction and treatment of child maltreatment. And among his many areas of focus is gay and lesbian adoption and foster care placements. We will be taking audience questions later, so please send those at any time in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can after the initial conversation. With that being said, please welcome Conor Fetting-Smith and Professor Devon Brooks.
Thank you, Jonathan, thank you for being here, Devon. Thanks to everyone who's joining us. So I wanted to give everyone a little bit of background on the case Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia before we began. In 2018, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran an article to convey an urgent call for foster parents in the city of Philadelphia. There were over 300 youth waiting for homes, and the city had more child removals than any other city in the country. When Julia Taruso, a reporter for the Inquirer, published that article, she got a call from a woman by the name of Megan Pascoe. She and her wife had gone to Bethany Christian Services and were told that it wasn't worth the trouble of applying. So she was discouraged to see the call for foster parents, specifically focusing on underutilized groups like LGBTQ foster parents. The Inquirer ran the article after the reporter, Julia Taruso, did her due diligence to find that there were in fact 2 foster care agencies in the city that were not accepting same-sex or single foster parents. The city responded by freezing those 2 contracts. So Bethany Christian Services and Catholic Social Services were not able to continue accepting foster parents and placing foster youth into foster families. And a legal battle ensued when Catholic Social Services decided to sue the city of Philadelphia for violation of their First Amendment rights to freely exercise their religion. Bethany Christian Services ended up working with LGBTQ foster parents. But the Catholic Social Services case would go on up until June of this year when the Supreme Court released its decision. But before it did so, it went through District Court in Philadelphia, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals. Catholic Social Services also appealed to the Supreme Court for an emergency injunctive relief to start up their foster care program again. And all three of these cases denied Catholic Social Services request for the religious exemption or injunctive relief. But the Supreme Court decided to take the case, and it was the first case that Justice Amy Coney Barrett heard on November 4th of 2020, the day after the presidential election. So on June 17th of this year, the Supreme Court released its decision that Catholic Social Services was indeed due an exception to the non-discrimination policy by the city of Philadelphia, which protects on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It was not a far-reaching overhaul of the current precedent for religious exemptions in the 1990 ruling Employment Division versus Smith, but it did rule that Catholic Social Services can open its doors once again and continue to serve foster youth in Philadelphia without the inclusion of same-sex parents or single parents. So the purpose of this talk today is to understand, how does this ruling affect LGBTQ foster youth, who make up 30% of all foster youth and 40% of all youth experiencing homelessness. That's compared to 9.5% of American youth who identify as LGBTQ. And we've got Devon Brooks here, who's able to help us answer some of these questions. The first question I had for you, Devon, is what are the goals of foster care? And is it in the best interest of foster care's mission to have some agencies that don't work with LGBTQ parents?
Yeah, so thanks, Connor, and thanks everyone for being here. Great question to get us started with today. So the goals of foster care revolve primarily around children. That's really an important point. Public child welfare services intend essentially to exist, essentially to ensure that children are free from maltreatment, that they're free from abuse and neglect. And if they are victims of maltreatment, public child welfare systems and agencies exist to intervene. Okay. But again, it's really important to understand that public child welfare exists primarily for children, not so much for families or parents or caregivers. So as I indicated, first and foremost is the goal related to child maltreatment prevention and treatment. Secondarily, child welfare exists in order to preserve families, so to keep families intact. So this essentially means that if a family is struggling, if a parent is experiencing certain kinds of stressors, hopefully child welfare agencies will come to know about the challenges the family is experiencing, and then subsequently intervene to offer supports to the family to keep the family intact, so that the need to remove a child never is acted on. However, if a child welfare worker determines that maltreatment, either abuse or neglect, has in fact occurred, or if there is a high risk, a high likelihood of maltreatment occurring, then at that point, the social worker, the child welfare worker, aims to remove the child temporarily to ensure that the child is safe. That usually means placement in the foster care system. At that point, the child welfare agency aims to work closely with the family of origin, and if the child has been placed in foster care, to work closely with the foster family to do one thing: to reunify the child with their family, to make sure that the family's strong enough so that the child can return and exist in the family safely. When that can't happen, the child welfare system aims to locate other permanent placements for children, placements that will keep children safe. That can involve placing a child in long-term guardian foster care placements. It can involve placing the child in an adoptive placement. So there are different types of permanent placements. That's usually seen as a last resort, not meaning it's less than the other options, but it typically only occurs after all of these other efforts to keep families intact, to reunify them, and then finally, when reunification isn't possible, to place the children in permanent families. So let me stop there, Conor, to see if you have any questions about the goals of foster care before I move on to the second part.
No, I think that's clear. And so I would just ask you the second part, is it in the best interest of that mission to have some agencies that don't work with same-sex foster parents?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, and I'm gonna come at it in two ways. My initial response is no. That is, it's not in the best interest of foster youth to have some agencies that don't work with LGBTQ foster parents or youth. And the reason I say that is related to what I just described in terms of the goals of public child welfare. If the goal of public child welfare, and specifically foster care, a particular function or aspect of public child welfare, is to ensure that children and families are safe, then agencies that work with children and families and that have contracts and agreements with public child welfare agencies, in my opinion, should be providing the needed services for children and caregivers, potential caregivers. So if an agency determines that they do not want to serve a particular population because they recognize that they don't have the capacity to adequately serve that population, then I think things get a little bit more complicated. In that sense, the agency is actually potentially doing a good thing. They're recognizing that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the social workers, the child welfare workers, to do the jobs that we expect them to do. At that point, the intervention, in my opinion, would be to work with the agency to help build their capacity to serve children and families in need of their services. That's different from an agency that determines they, in my opinion, they want to discriminate. That they feel certain kinds of children and families should not receive the kinds of services they offer. I think that is problematic, and so there are two different. For me, there are two different approaches to addressing the situation that you ask about. One, I believe, involves addressing discriminatory practices. The other, I am more sympathetic towards. We've seen in the past certain kinds of child welfare agencies recognize their limitations in serving certain kinds of populations. For example, public child welfare agencies will subcontract. They'll reach out to other agencies if, for example, they feel they don't have the capacity to work with kids of color, African-American kids, Hispanic, Latino kids, or kids with special needs and disabilities. So in those instances, the agency is saying, you know what, we really can't, we don't feel we're in the best position to provide the services that the child needs. So two different answers depending on the frame of the question.
And I'm just going to ask a follow-up here, but I think it's important to distinguish, and Devon, correct me if I'm wrong, but that there are kind of different judgments that the agency is making, or there are different times when you know, they're evaluating the potential foster parents. First is just coming in and having, you know, an information session, showing parents what foster care is about, what the goals of foster care are, in the same way that you laid it out for us. And then another is evaluating the needs of the child and making sure that parents can meet those needs. You know, Megan Pascoe, in this case, who went to an information session, was not yet at the stage where she was having her home evaluated or her background check was going through. So can you maybe just talk about, confirm or deny whether I'm, you know, wrong in most cases, that there are these two kind of separate times when the agency is evaluating the foster parent. And from my perspective, it seems like there's a need to have, for that first stage, all kinds of parents come in and get involved and see where they can go and best meet the needs of children.
Okay.
But let me know if you agree or disagree.
I agree. You're exactly right. So a foster care agency in general wants to ensure that they've got the largest pool of foster parents or prospective foster parents available to them. And so the idea is anybody out there who is interested or who could become interested in being a foster care provider, the agency presumably would welcome working with them in order to have a pool that then would allow them to address the second goal that you alluded to. If there is a large pool of parents, then when children come in with different needs, the social worker can understand the needs of the child and then begin thinking about matching the child with parents in the pool. So ideally, having a large pool means that when a prospective approved foster parents means that when children come in, again, with varying needs, the social worker doesn't have to rely on the one or two parents that are approved. They have some options. They can then think about the well-being, the needs of the particular child, and try to find a match that is the strongest match possible for the child. So so often in child welfare, we talk about recruitment and placement. So what you described involves the recruitment aspect of child welfare, just getting families into the pool. And that means sometimes working with prospective families that start out with some challenges that aren't as strong as you hope they will be. So there is a courting process. Child welfare workers will often work with caregivers who aren't quite ready to raise a certain child, but they're interested. The child welfare worker is engaging the prospective caregivers, identifying needs that they have, providing them with resources and education so that they are as strong as possible and ready to provide care for a child when a placement is necessary.
Thank you. So the next question I have is when a young person in foster care identifies as LGBTQ, are they treated differently by the system?
Yeah. Another great question and a complicated question. So keep in mind that there are different goals, as we said earlier. So there are different goals, different pathways, different stages of child welfare involvement. Foster care is only, as we said, one piece of it. So when let's say a call comes in from a teacher who suspects maltreatment, calls a hotline and communicates some of the concerns, the hotline worker will do an assessment, try to gather information. At that point, probably very little difference in treatment. Okay. As the child moves through the system, let's say the hotline worker hears something, gets some information that makes the child, makes the hotline worker believe that maltreatment is occurring or that the child is at risk of maltreatment. And therefore, a social worker, someone needs to go out and do an investigation. At that point, there probably is still, in most instances, little treatment of the LGBTQ child versus the heterosexual straight child. Okay? Because the social worker is out to determine whether or not maltreatment has occurred. And if not, is there a risk of maltreatment? So probably similar treatment at that point. Even the decision to remove a child is likely to be approached in a similar way, regardless of the sexual orientation of the child. It's typically not until later in the matching process that we were talking about earlier, when a social worker has removed a child and then is starting to think about the kind of family that is best, that can provide the best kind of care for the child, that we start to see differences in treatment emerge. At that point, it is entirely possible that a social worker doesn't have the competence, the training, or maybe they have certain attitudes related to sexual orientation that might creep into the decision making that results in LGBTQ children being treated differently than their straight counterparts. And this is a really complicated issue because on one hand, the social worker, the child welfare worker, often believes that not treating differently is a good thing. Okay? So it's not necessarily the case that this child welfare worker is intentionally trying to discriminate. In their minds, they're treating children in the same way. They're approaching the way that they work with them in the same way. They believe that that's a good thing. The problem is that because they may not understand fully that sometimes kids with certain characteristics and experiences, including LGBTQ kids, have had certain experiences that they might be treated differently by siblings in a foster home than straight kids, that they might be bullied by kids at school, and therefore the caregivers should have ideally some knowledge and some skills. They should understand how to work with those kids. They should feel comfortable talking with kids about those experiences. It's really in those instances that we might see treatment become more problematic, or the lack of different treatment become more problematic. So towards the matching, thinking about the kinds of parents that could provide the kind of care necessary for a particular child.
Yeah, and I'm just going to take an audience question here as a follow-up, because I think it's a great follow-up to this. You know, what happens when a child has been in a placement, identifies as LGBTQ, perhaps it wasn't, you know, apparent at the placement, or they're coming into their identity, and they identify as LGBTQ, and it's obvious to them or the social worker that that family is not accepting of that. You know, are there resources that are provided, or is there intervention that happens?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and you said something that's important. You made the distinction between something that is known at the time of a match or placement versus something that emerges later, which happens a lot of times, right? When a kid comes into foster care, the goal generally is to return the child to their family. So there's a special kind of person that says, you know what, I'm willing to provide temporary care, to do everything I can to get this kid back home to their family, right? That is the first goal. But also for that caregiver, the foster caregiver, to say, and you know what, if that can't happen, I'm willing to provide care as a permanent legal parent for that child. That is the law. So it used to be the case that prospective parents could say, you know what, I'm not interested in adopting, I only want to be a foster parent. Or for other parents to say, nope, I'm not interested in being an adoptive parent, a foster parent, I only want to adopt. Now, foster parents are approved to be adoptive parents. Adoptive parents are approved to be foster parents. So if a child, let's say child is lesbian, has needs related to that, or there is some sense on the part of the social worker that even if needs related to sexual orientation don't exist now because the kid is 5 or 6, as an adolescent, maybe because of where she lives, she might experience some challenges because of the way that kids in the community or the community might treat her. Hopefully the social worker is thinking about these things and thinking about not just the needs that exist now, but as the child continues to grow. And in making a placement, when thinking about the match, hopefully the social worker is thinking about the capacity of that caregiver to raise a child who might experience challenges due to discrimination later as a teenager. Okay, so that's easier to address, right? Because as part of the assessment process, as part of the home study process, the social worker screening the parent, working with the parent to ensure that they can raise the child as part of the match, the social worker knows what they're working with. If, however, the child is in foster care and the family is providing temporary foster care and sexual orientation emerges, issues related to sexual orientation emerge later on, and the foster parent determines that there's no longer a good fit for whatever reason. It could be that for personal reasons, because of their values, they determined that they no longer want the child in that home. At that point, the child welfare worker will try to work with the family to raise their awareness, to address their concerns, especially if the child has been with the family for a while, because the child welfare worker is now thinking about permanency and stability and It could be that the child has a relationship with the family. So at that point, the child welfare worker would very likely work with the family to see if there is a way to intervene and to help move the family so that the child can stay safely in the family, and so that their well-being is as strong and as enhanced as much as it can be. If, however, the parent says we are no longer willing to raise any child, the child can be removed from the home. The caregiver can determine that they're not willing to continue providing care for a particular type of child. Now, there are all kinds of repercussions of that kind of decision in terms of future placements. It could be that the child welfare agency says, you know what, we're done working with you at this point, because we really do need caregivers who can assure us that they're willing. Think about this, the stakes are so high. For a child who's experienced maltreatment, presumably that's why they're removed from perhaps the only family they've known. They've been placed in another temporary family, perhaps becoming a permanent family, only for that family to say, you know what, there's something about you that we don't like. Think about the impact of that on the kids. So a good child welfare worker, a good social worker is anticipating that as they're recruiting and preparing foster parents for placement. It is also possible that, let's say a foster parent has that kid that we're talking about, said, oh, no, you know what, I'm fine raising a child who is lesbian, even though I didn't know that. The social worker is still intervening. There's still visits, there's still meetings. It is still the responsibility of that social worker in the system to ensure that there's the highest quality of care for that child as possible. The social worker can determine that the parent is not capable of raising that child, despite all of the efforts to intervene. And as difficult as it may be, if a social worker determines that a child's safety and well-being warrant removing the child from that family, that may be a difficult decision, but because the social worker is doing it, presumably in the best interest of the child, it may be a decision that's made.
Great. I think that gets us to our next question, which is, and you were talking about it a little already, but what is affirming care? Why don't we just start there?
Yeah, so there's no one definition, no one way of thinking about affirming care. So sometimes people think about it as a concept or as values. Other times models, theories, frameworks have been developed around the larger concept, the more amorphous concept of affirming care. So generally speaking, I would say affirming care involves recognizing, celebrating individuals' youth for who they are, for all that they are. For a professional, just valuing and celebrating youth or a caregiver for who they are, it's a good start, but it's not enough. Okay? So for professionals, I'm as indicated earlier, I'm on the faculty in the School of Social Work. And one of the things we do in working with students and training them for professional practice is to ensure that in addition to the desire to help, we take very seriously our responsibility of providing them with the knowledge and the skills to work effectively and competently with children or with individuals who have different kinds of needs, characteristics, or experiences. So they have to be, so affirming care also involves having the knowledge, the skills, the abilities to, in social work, to engage with individuals, to effectively assess the strengths and needs that they have, to intervene in different ways, whether it's through policy or through community organizing or providing clinical services or informal support through, say, a church or a community center, and also to evaluate, right? Because it's not good enough to, we believe, for social workers to just intervene, but they also have to evaluate what they're doing. They've got to be able to say they are confident that they have provided, for example, affirming care in the way that they've conceptualized it and operationalized it. And they've got to go beyond that to be able to say this kind of care actually matters. It actually makes a difference. We see that the experience that providing affirming care is better in the specified ways than providing care that is not affirming. So I will also add that there are different kinds of affirmative practice, right? So there's affirming practice based on sexual orientation, LGBTQ affirming practice. There's gender affirming practice. There's affirming practice based on race or ethnicity, or other aspects of diversity that individuals might have. So it's a lot to juggle, right? It's a lot to be thinking about in the case of a child who might have different aspects, and this is where an intersectional lens is really important. There might be different aspects of who a particular youth is, right? How they identify, how others treat them, that require a care provider to be attuned to and to consider as they're thinking about the kind of care that they're providing. Hopefully all of it is affirming, but sometimes there, certain aspects of who one is become more important. And we want to make sure that all caregivers are able to provide the type of affirming care that is needed. And when they can't, that they can refer and turn to their colleagues to provide care as part of a team.
Great. And in social work in the United States, there is a national standard of care, is there not?
So there is for social workers in the US, there's a code of ethics, and there's a standard of care that is sometimes explicit and operationalized. Other times it's conceptual. It's kind of fuzzy because it's more conceptual. And so sometimes there are concepts that are part of our code of ethics that then when it comes time to actualizing or implementing or acting on the values essentially of the profession get a little bit messier because they can be interpreted in different ways. But yes, there is in the US, we have the national NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, NASW Code of Ethics.
And is affirming care a part of that, like specifically for LGBTQ youth?
I would have to check the Code of Ethics to see if that language specifically, as it relates specifically to sexual orientation, is part of the language of the Code of Ethics. Affirming care is. I'm not sure how specific the language is, though.
Got it.
And Conor, for anyone who's interested, they're welcome to email me afterwards. I can also provide links, and I might be able to do that even before we leave today, to the NASW Code of Ethics to just look to see what that entails.
Awesome. So, if people out there are social workers or educators, students, foster parents, prospective foster parents, how do they stay up to date on the latest kind of practices, say affirming care, or just the latest information about working with LGBTQ foster youth?
Fantastic question again. So in an institution of higher ed, the primary way that people, future social workers, for example, or others who might work with LGBTQ youth or families, become knowledgeable, they get their education through the formal degree program. So for example, our MSW program, in the School of Social Work, we offer an accredited degree, a Master of Social Work. We start with the NASW Code of Ethics, the values and standards we were talking about earlier. But because we're an accredited School of Social Work, there's another body, an accredited, the body that accredits us as an MSW program. That body is the Council on Social Work Education. It tells us what we need to do as a School of Social Work, as an accredited School of Social Work. So it takes those values and it says, for example, that there are different kinds of competencies, right? That your students have to be able to demonstrate by the time they graduate. So there are competencies that are related to working with individuals and approaching the work with those individuals through an intersectional lens. So for us in the School of Social Work, we take very seriously affirming care, even if we don't always use that language, right? So it is not okay to discriminate, to disadvantage, to oppress based on sexual orientation or other aspects of self. It is not okay to give certain advantages or access or privileges to one based on who they are, what they look like, who they love. We train our students to be aware of that and to ensure that in the work that they're doing, they are trained to perform in a way that we think reflects the values of the profession and the code of ethics. We also provide in our schools some ongoing learning, some professional development. So a lot of times students graduate, they go on to become professional social workers. They're just not getting the current research. They're not getting new theories, new models that are being developed all the time. And maybe they're getting them just for the time that they're enrolled in a degree program, whether that's at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level. We try to provide ongoing training for professionals, for students once they graduate. Or maybe there are graduates from another social work program who are working, for example, in Los Angeles County. So we try to provide them with ongoing continuing ed or professional development. Different words are used to refer to the same idea, lifelong learning of professionals. Some agencies and some systems will provide ongoing training of certain kinds for the professionals that work in their systems. Unfortunately, Conor, in my opinion, that there's not enough of that kind of training. Notice what we're talking about today is it's actually pretty specialized. Right. So it wouldn't be unusual, for example, for a child welfare agency to provide ongoing training of assessment or matching or placement, or receiving a phone call and determining whether or not there is maltreatment and whether or not a child needs to be removed. That kind of training and ongoing training tends to be the kind of training that is more available for professionals. So we do have to, the School of Social Work, USC, I know we're very interested in ongoing training, reaching out to to professionals. But you also asked about foster parents, right? So in the way that, unfortunately, in the same way that a child welfare agency might not offer a lot of ongoing training to the professionals that work in their agencies, they also don't offer a lot of ongoing training to foster parents. So, and that's a shortcoming. That's something that in my area, in child welfare and social work, we're trying to address all the time, because it's not good enough. It's not adequate to think that a foster parent can receive a child, have a child placed with them when the child is 2, and then 5 years later, 10 years later, when there's a different world, when there's more knowledge available, when there's more information, when there are new laws, for that foster parent to, on their own, reach out and try to find resources and information to ensure that they're as knowledgeable as possible. We've got to do a better job to make it easy for them to do that.
Thank you. We've got some Q&A questions that I want to get to, and I don't know if you know the answer to all of these, but let's give it a shot. Okay. Do you know if the county, LA County, has if a kid self-identifies as LGBTQ, if they're tracking that information?
They don't. So yes and no. The information can come up in various assessments, or in case notes when working with a child. So a child's sexual orientation might be known, and in some instances, the social worker, lots of instances, the social worker might ask, might want to get that information, because it's important, as we discussed earlier, when thinking about matching, or when thinking about offering certain kinds of services. But I have reservations. I hesitated in responding because the information isn't necessarily tracked. It might be part of a case record. So in the way that we have, LA County routinely does have certain kinds of information about the characteristics, gender, some basic information of race or ethnicity. Sexual orientation might be known, but I don't believe it is an item that is part of the routine assessment form.
Got it. Yeah, and then I'll just add that some of the stats that I was using at the top are coming from places like the Williams Institute, right, or the Trevor Project, who are doing studies into youth in the country that identify as LGBTQ or foster youth, et cetera. So those are the sources that I was using for those stats.
And that's pretty much how, so they're the kind of data that, for example, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services, other child welfare agencies often collect, are referred to as, a lot of times, as administrative data. And those data aren't very good always for addressing these kinds of issues. Child welfare agencies can supplement that data. So they might have the basic data on demographics and characteristics, but any particular agency might supplement the data, and the feds don't require sexual orientation to that data to be collected. And so that makes it does make it hard to understand some of these issues at the federal level, and then of course at the state level. So often we're relying on smaller studies or agencies that do collect the data. In California uses across the state, there's a basically an assessment system and protocol where a lot of really detailed information is collected. It's not necessarily always required. And so there are some good data on characteristics and needs of children and families that we're lucky to have in California, because we happen to collect in the state of California, or the Department of Social Services at the state level requires all counties to use the same system. So we're lucky to get some of that information.
Okay. One more question is, have there been any studies done since the June Supreme Court decision to determine if there's been an increase in agencies around the country refusing to work with LGBTQ youth or foster parents? And to be clear, Catholic Social Services is not refusing to work with LGBTQ youth in this case. I think that's one of the conundrums of their position, is that they do work with LGBTQ youth, and foster youth don't choose what agency they're working with. But I don't know of any studies. I know of other cases out there, like there's one in South Carolina, Rogers versus Health and Human Services, which is another agency, Miracle Hill Ministries, which is the largest foster care provider in South Carolina, which does not work with LGBTQ foster parents. Devon, do you know of any studies like that?
To my knowledge, there have been no studies. There are no recent studies, although I will say I did see before coming on an email from a faculty member in another department who indicated that she and some of her colleagues were looking at some of these issues in general. I think they were trying to understand, and I can get her information and perhaps share it after today's meeting. I think they were looking at the impact of these kinds of policies and practices on different aspects of placement. And so I don't know that I think that work was ongoing. Also keep in mind that there are times that a policy or decision will be made, and it might be years for it actually to show up in practice. So my hunch is that there probably has not been a research just yet following up on the decision.
Okay, and so we're getting to time, but one more question. What type of intake is happening to ensure that foster families are able to provide affirming care? Like, how are those decisions, or kind of how's that being made by agencies?
Yeah, generally that kind of assessment and preparation is part of what's referred to as a home study process. So basically somebody says, I'm interested in learning more about being a foster parent, or I want to be a foster parent. There is then a series of trainings and assessments. A social worker has to, go out and investigate the home, and there's a lot that goes into assessing whether or not the prospective foster family meets certain standards. However, the ability of a foster parent to provide care and raise certain kinds of children. That is not always part of the home study process. Some social workers who don't feel comfortable saying the word gay will therefore not ask about sexual orientation. So the home study process can be problematic because a lot of times it is left to the discretion of the social worker or the agency that the social worker works for. Good social workers will assess, will ask, will include lots of different kinds of assessments, because the goal isn't to screen out, it's to identify the strengths that exist in a caregiver, and if there are limitations, are there ways to address those limitations, right? If somebody doesn't have the knowledge, we need parents, we need good caregivers. And so if we can intervene by giving them knowledge, giving them information, changing their attitudes, we will intervene in that way. We need a lot more knowledge about the indicators that are associated with good parenting. And that knowledge continues, even 10 years ago, there wasn't very good empirical knowledge available that would help social workers understand what should be assessed as a predictor, as basically a strength, something that's desirable versus something that's undesirable, especially when the same thing, the same factor for one kid can be a good thing, but for another kid can be a bad thing. And so that information, that knowledge, we need more of it. It is just beginning to develop.
Thank you, Devon. I think that's all the time that we've got. Jonathan or Blair, did you want to jump in here and close this out? I know that there's some links available if you want to take a look for the scholarship fund.
Absolutely. Thank you, Conor. Thank you, Devon. That was a wonderful and enlightening conversation. We will be following up with everybody, sending an email with resources and various links that you can check out for more information. And as Dr. Brooks said, if you want to follow up, he was more than happy to share his email. We can put that in the chat here for everybody if you'd like to access that. And one final mention again, if you are so inclined, please take a minute to donate to the Lambda or Social Work Scholarship Fund. Those links have been placed into the chat as well by my colleague Blair Chapman. So again, thank you all so much. This was a really wonderful and engaging conversation, a lot of really interesting information there. And I hope that you will all join our mailing list as well for future opportunities like this. We have a lot of great things in store over the course of the coming years. So please stay tuned. Conor, Devon, thank you both again so much, and everybody have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye.